Star Trek might be in some real trouble. There are rumors that when Alex Kurtzman's contract as franchise overseer for Star Trek expires in 2027, one of two things is likely to happen. Either the franchise will go dormant for the third time in its history, or Paramount might indeed sell the entire IP altogether. It kind of depends on exactly how bad Paramount's finances are right now, in the context of the still ongoing Skydance buyout. And even if that buyout completes without a hitch, the buyer, Skydance, is probably a little less than enthusiastic about Star Trek as an IP. So assuming these rumors are accurate, in a couple of years, we might be in for an extended period during which no new Star Trek content will be produced. But I also have kind of a crazy idea that just might help, at least a little bit. And while I don't know the first thing about producing content for television, I do have a day job that puts me on the logistics end of the TV streaming industry, so I do have some authority on this topic. But in order to understand why my idea might actually work, we really need to understand the problems that I'm trying to address, and there's definitely more than one. So let's start with how the biggest elephant in the room came to be in the room. Problem number one: too many corporate cooks. Now, even just trying to outline who controlled what about Star Trek at which times has been a real chore to spell out in detail, so after multiple attempts, the results of which I really just could not live with, I've decided to break the timeline down into 4 distinct ages of Star Trek, if you will. And full disclosure, I have not been able to find any authoritative consensus whatsoever on how to group and name these ages of Star Trek. So don't come at me for this, but I'm gonna decide for my own purposes what classifications to use and which eras they actually span, just for the sake of simplicity. So if you're gonna tell me I'm wrong, I hope you come prepared with receipts and links to authoritative sources to show me that I'm wrong. Do not at me in those comments without links, that's an order. With that said, here's how I'm gonna name and group the 4 different ages of Star Trek. The Bronze Age, from 1967 to 1974, the Silver Age, 1979 to 1986, the Golden Age, 1987 to 2005, and finally the Latinum Age. See what I did there? From 2009 to the present day. So let's find out how we got here by starting with the Bronze Age. When TOS first went on the air in 1967, there were just 3 different corporate entities involved. There was the creator, Gene Roddenberry, and his creative team. There was the TV studio, Desilu Productions, which at the time was solely owned by the iconic Lucille Ball, who, by the way, personally greenlit Star Trek into production. And finally, there was NBC, the broadcast network, who bought an exclusive license to broadcast the show. Partway through season 1 of TOS, Lucille Ball ended up selling Desilu Productions to the Gulf and Western Company, who had just recently bought Paramount Pictures, the film studio. Now, contrary to what you might think if you're using a 2025 mindset, GW didn't buy Desilu to eliminate any competition. They bought Desilu to enter the TV market. And that's important because it means they had no reason to get rid of Desilu. They simply rebranded it as Paramount Television. All active Desilu productions, including Star Trek, were slated to continue until further notice, under the new Paramount brand. So very shortly after getting on the air, TOS went from 3 corporate controllers to 4, exchanging Desilu for Paramount and GW. But while the new owners appeared to believe in Star Trek, the broadcast network, NBC, did not. They tried letting the broadcast license expire after season 2, but then the fans heard about that and led a letter-writing campaign to prevent that from happening. NBC listened and decided to renew the license for 1 more season. And since they hadn't actually changed their mind about anything, they pulled the same thing after season 3, and that time it stuck. There was no season 4. With no other network buyers at the table, Paramount was forced to send TOS into syndication rather than continue into a 4th season. And for the uninitiated, syndication means that the show went into rerun mode, essentially, and that means that the broadcast license is up for grabs to anyone who wants it, and it's not exclusive. As many networks as want a license can get one, and that means that the reruns can be shown basically anywhere. And to everyone's surprise, TOS ended up doing so well in syndication that NBC convinced themselves to bring it back, but in animated form. And that's how we got Star Trek the Animated Series for 2 seasons between 1973 and 74. But unfortunately, that show didn't make a big enough splash for NBC standards, and so that show also ended up getting canceled after season 2. So once again, Paramount found themselves with a valuable IP on their hands and an enthusiastic fan base screaming for more content, but no TV broadcast networks interested in putting Star Trek on the air. And so the Star Trek franchise went dormant for the first time, bringing an end to the Bronze Age. But that was just the beginning, the Silver Age. So that's when the thought occurred to Paramount, who needs outside TV networks when we already control one of the industry's finest film studios? We could just transition Star Trek into movies, and that way we can control the entire process front to back. So that's exactly what they did. And 5 years later, in 1979, Star Trek the Motion Picture hit the big screen and made a truckload of money for Paramount, so of course a sequel was in order. But crucially, they decided that Gene Roddenberry himself was just not cut out for films, like at all. He had been tolerable when Star Trek was on television, but when it came to movies, Roddenberry was frankly kind of a liability. So for the sequel, Paramount ended up giving Roddenberry a desk job as a consultant and handed the actual reins to writers Harve Bennett and Nicholas Meyer. And thus, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan hit cinemas in 1982, and that movie also performed extremely well. But not only that, it also became kind of a cultural icon, and thus cemented Star Trek's status as one of Paramount's flagship IPs. But things got really interesting in 1984 when a man named Frank Mancuso Sr. became the CEO at Paramount. You see, Mancuso loved Star Trek. In fact, he loved it so much he called it the crown jewel in Paramount's lineup. But around the time he became CEO, the TOS cast had started getting quite a bit more aggressive in their contract negotiations. They were starting to ask for so much money that Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home almost never got off the ground in 1986. But that wasn't the only problem with the cast. They were also getting pretty old. Mancuso saw writing on the wall for TOS and decided that some new blood was in order to keep the franchise alive. But the stakes of the movie industry were a bit too high for him to risk his favorite IP on a bunch of untested actors. So instead of that, he went to Roddenberry and asked him to bring Star Trek back to television with a new show. And this time, they wouldn't even try selling an exclusive license for it to some major broadcast network. You see, Mancuso believed that the reason Star Trek had to leave television in the first place was because the broadcast networks either couldn't or didn't want to figure out how to market Star Trek. And he didn't really believe that the successful film run would necessarily make that any easier for them. He believed Star Trek deserved to be on television. He just was keen to avoid relying on any outside networks to make it happen. Subtle foreshadow here. I happen to believe that on this point, Mancuso's read was laser accurate. I frankly couldn't agree with him more. So to that end, Mancuso convinced Gulf and Western to allow him to sell off a bunch of subsidiaries and use the proceeds from those sales to buy up a slew of local television stations across the United States. His goal was to eventually coalesce these stations into a new broadcast network that would be fully controlled by Paramount, and it would be called the United Paramount Network, or UPN. But as you might expect, launching a broadcast network takes kind of a long time, and in fact it takes significantly longer than it takes someone like Gene Roddenberry to make a new show. So the next question was, what do we do with this new show in the meantime? It was definitely going to be ready a long time before UPN would be. But if they launched it on an outside network, not only would that kind of undermine Mancuso's inner workings to create an in-house network, it would also mean that when UPN was ready, the show would already have external parties with a controlling stake in it, and those parties would be competitors for UPN. In no universe did Mancuso want that to happen. And besides, he knew that TOS had found a much larger audience when NBC had forced it into syndication. So he went to Roddenberry and said, "How do you feel about the new show going straight into syndication on day one?" Roddenberry, for his part, was still bitter about how NBC's myopia had already screwed him twice, once with TOS and once with TAS, so he didn't need any convincing. He was only too happy to agree to any plan that would keep those fickle, clueless suits off his back. And so, in 1987, Star Trek: The Next Generation hit the airwaves in first-run syndication and began a slow takeover of the entire TV sci-fi genre. The golden age of Star Trek had officially begun. From 1987 to 1991, Star Trek existed in two concurrent iterations. We had the films, led mostly by Harve Bennett and Nicholas Meyer, and then on Paramount Television, we had The Next Generation, led by Gene Roddenberry and Rick Berman. At this point, the entirety of Star Trek's operations was controlled solely by the Paramount umbrella under the Gulf and Western leadership. But the increasing strength of the Paramount brand eventually led GW to rebrand itself as Paramount Communications in 1989. Now, 1991 was a particularly pivotal year for the franchise, thanks to three nearly simultaneous events. The first was that Gene Roddenberry passed away at 70 years old. The second was the release of the film Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country, which officially ended the TOS era, passing the torch completely to TNG. Side note, in the wake of these events, Harve Bennett and Nicholas Meyer would both step away from Star Trek to pursue other ventures, which left Rick Berman as the de facto franchise overseer to succeed Gene Roddenberry. The third thing that happened in 1991 was that Frank Mancuso stepped down as CEO of Paramount and was succeeded by Sherry Lansing. The groundwork Mancuso had laid for launching the bespoke television network for Paramount, UPN, would continue under Lansing, and by 1992, those efforts under her leadership were starting to round the final corners. So her administration asked Rick Berman and writer Michael Piller to get a new show ready. But once again, the fates conspired to delay the launch of the network past when the show was going to be ready. So, like its predecessor, Star Trek Deep Space Nine also launched in first-run syndication in 1993. Around that same time, talks started brewing about the possibility of transitioning TNG into films, while Lansing still wanted a Star Trek show to serve as the launch title for UPN. So, by 1994, Paramount Pictures released the first TNG film, Generations, along with Paramount Television releasing the second season of DS9 and launching Star Trek Voyager on UPN, which officially brought the number of corporate divisions with their hands in Star Trek's production process to 5. But 1994 was eventful for other reasons as well. That was the year that the mass media conglomerate Viacom swooped in to buy Paramount Communications and all of its subsidiaries and intellectual properties. The day-to-day operations within Paramount went largely unaffected by this development, at least at first, but nevertheless, it did bring the number of corporate divisions with their hands in Star Trek's production to 6 now, with Viacom at the top, then Paramount Global, Paramount Pictures, Paramount Television, UPN, and the Star Trek franchise itself under Rick Berman. So that brings us to the year 2000, and wow, was this a rough transition for Star Trek. DS9 wrapped production on its 7th and final season, with Voyager following suit in 2001. The TNG film series was still ongoing, but by this point, Paramount and the fans were pretty much in agreement with each other that Star Trek was in its top form on television. So once again, Lansing's administration asked Berman for a new show, this time with the help of writer Brannon Braga, who had worked extensively on Voyager. But what Paramount didn't know was that Berman was burnt out. He was already working on plans to exit Star Trek. But of course, he wanted the franchise to continue after his departure, so he was experimenting with creative minds that were not super experienced with Star Trek. This experimental time saw Berman hire director Stuart Baird and writer John Logan to work on the TNG film Nemesis, which released in 2002. The release of that film was hot on the heels of the release of the new show Enterprise at the end of 2001. By the summer of 2002, both were on the market, and the reception to both of them was mostly negative. In fact, Nemesis performed so badly that Paramount Pictures decided that they weren't going to make another TNG film, which effectively brought an unceremonious end to the TNG era. This left Enterprise as the only iteration of Star Trek still active, and even as the last one standing, it still couldn't command the same audience as TNG, DS9, and Voyager. Now, the beginning of the new millennium was also a pretty eventful time for Viacom. While DS9 was in the process of wrapping up in 2000, Viacom had acquired the massive television broadcast network CBS, an entity that Paramount's own UPN had been trying and failing to compete with. That, plus the slow motion failure that was Enterprise, ultimately called into question not just the future of UPN, but the future of the Star Trek franchise as a whole. And by 2005, those questions found their answers. That was the year Enterprise was canceled after 4 seasons, at which point Rick Berman finally stepped down as Star Trek's overseer. That same year, Viacom decided to send CBS on its own separate path after just a 5-year partnership, which on one hand soothed away any fears that UPN was going to be merged with CBS, but only for a very, very short time, because it turned out that as part of this split maneuver, Viacom opted to transfer UPN's ownership to CBS, and what CBS did with that was they decided to merge it with Warner Brothers to form the CW network in 2006. And so, with no active iterations of the Star Trek franchise, no broadcast networks interested in buying licenses for that franchise, and no franchise overseer, Star Trek went dormant for the second time, bringing an end to its golden age. Costume change. Okay, y'all, this Latinum Age part of the video is the part that I've been dreading the most ever since this idea came to me a few months ago, because the corporate entanglement that informs this particular era of Star Trek is just an absolute rat's nest. In fact, before I continue with the Latinum Age, I actually have to go add something I forgot to include during the Golden Age. If I don't, everything I say next will be harder for me to say and harder for you to track. I promise it wasn't entirely relevant before, but it's inescapable now, so here goes. So in 1987, when Paramount Television launched TNG into syndication, and 7 years before Viacom bought Paramount, Viacom itself had been bought by a mass media holdings firm called National Amusements. And the reason that wasn't relevant before is because none of that affected Paramount at the time. But it is relevant now because everything Viacom did after 87 was either allowed or ordered by National Amusements. That includes buying Paramount in '94 and buying CBS in 2000, but it also includes their splitting back up in 2005, and it's actually that 2005 split where the story really gets bonkers. And for this part, I simply cannot go as deep here as I normally would, because It is just too dense, so here comes the criminally brief version. Viacom bought CBS to wash their hands of UPN because its audience fell off a cliff when Star Trek went dormant. And without UPN, or any significant first-party programming and syndication anywhere, Paramount TV was in similar shape. But CBS wasn't exactly rock steady either, otherwise they wouldn't have sold to Viacom. So National Amusements did some calculus and decided to move Paramount TV under CBS during the split, but kept Paramount Pictures under Viacom. The Viacom side remained profitable and was no longer weighed down by having to compensate for the struggling on the CBS side of things. All of it still belonged to National Amusements, but crucially, Paramount's film and TV divisions were now controlled by totally different companies, one of which was a broadcast network. Gene Roddenberry is glad he wasn't around to watch that happen. These conditions made it highly unlikely that Star Trek would be able to come back to TV anytime soon, so since Paramount Pictures was still thriving, it was decided that Star Trek's revival would have to happen in the cinema first. But they wanted something different, something new. So they hired director J.J. Abrams and writers Robert Orci and Alex Kurtzman to reboot the franchise with the new film Star Trek releasing in the spring of 2009. Importantly, Abrams and Kurtzman both insisted that their respective production companies, Bad Robot and Secret Hideout, be also contracted and credited for the production. So how many corporate cooks were in the kitchen by this point? After all the shuffling, the number settled at 7. National Amusements, Viacom, CBS, Paramount Pictures, Paramount Television, Bad Robot, and Secret Hideout. Star Trek 09 was the biggest hit in franchise history, so it got 2 sequels. See my videos on those movies for more information about that. By 2016, National Amusements was confident that Star Trek was finally ready for a TV comeback and asked Kurtzman to help Brian Fuller, who was the former lead writer on seasons 4 through 7 of Voyager, to make it happen. Oh, and they brought back the legend himself, Nicholas Meyer, as writer and consultant. But distributing the show was going to be a very interesting challenge because the streaming revolution was very much in progress and transforming the entire industry. So CBS rather ambitiously decided to launch a bespoke streaming platform called CBS All Access, with the new Star Trek show Discovery serving as its launch title. It was like UPN all over again. Shortly after production began on Discovery, Brian Fuller, the showrunner, started fighting with CBS over staffing and budget decisions. He also openly hated the guy that CBS hired to direct the pilot, and also unilaterally hired 2 additional showrunners to assist him while he was actively working on other projects at the same time. CBS was not pleased, to put it mildly, and ultimately fired Fuller before season 1 wrapped, and fired the other showrunners he had hired after season 1 was over. Then, National Amusements offered Alex Kurtzman a contract to become both Discovery's new showrunner and Star Trek's next franchise overseer, succeeding Rick Berman. Naturally, Kurtzman accepted. As for Nicholas Meyer, once season 1 of Discovery was complete, he shifted focus to a different Star Trek project that unfortunately was over before it started. Since then, he has continued to write Sherlock Holmes novels, doing promotional tours for those books, and following yours truly on TikTok. Thank you again, sir, if you're watching. When Discovery finally launched with CBS All Access on September 24, 2017, it certainly made a splash, but it was clear almost immediately that the new platform wasn't going to meet the financial targets that CBS had set for it. Even after rounding up the rest of Star Trek's library so that the only way to watch Star Trek content was to pay money to CBS All Access, it just didn't attract the volume of fans that they were expecting. So very quickly, National Amusements started considering the possibility of another merger to steady the books. But while that was happening, Kurtzman was making waves with a huge change of direction for season 2 of Discovery. I don't have time to cover all that again because I already did like 3 full-length TikTok videos on Discovery last year, so go watch that if you want more about that. Suffice it to say that when season 2 did post, the engagement spiked just enough to convince CBS that Star Trek might still save their hides, but it would require significant investment and rapid expansion on a scale that the franchise had never seen before. So by the end of 2018, plans were underway for an absolutely staggering 6 different shows to be in simultaneous production: Discovery, Picard, Lower Decks, Prodigy, Strange New Worlds, and Section 31. But it was also short-lived. From 2019 to 2023, a series of unfortunate events would eventually force Kurtzman to halt production on just about everything. It started when National Amusements decided to re-merge Viacom and CBS in 2019, undoing the 2005 split. At the same time, they had also recently acquired Nickelodeon and Pluto TV. All of this was to pad out the content in CBS All Access's library, most of which had Paramount's brand on it by this point. So the immediate parent company, now called Viacom CBS, decided to rebrand the streaming platform as Paramount Plus. Now, I hope you're wondering what a struggling megacorp was doing launching a bunch of really expensive shows while going on a buying spree. Because as you'd expect, spending all that money when the water is already up to your waist is kind of a risky move. To be fair, it might have worked, but we'll never know because right after that happened, the COVID-19 pandemic hit and disrupted everything worldwide. Then, as soon as that dust finally settled, the Writers Guild and Screen Actors Guild both went on strike, which once again shut down productions across the entire industry and set timelines back by at least another year on average. By the time those storms were finally over, Viacom CBS as a whole was kind of in disarray, so everything needed to get a lot cheaper very quickly. Kurtzman was forced to end Discovery and Lower Decks after 5 seasons, which none of the writers were prepared to do particularly gracefully. Picard ended on schedule after a limited 3-season run. Prodigy was sold to Netflix before season 2 had even posted, and while they had the option of renewing season 3 if they wanted, Netflix recently announced that they've decided not to do that. So Prodigy is just gone now, which makes me very sad. Section 31 was hastily and sloppily converted from a series with a partially filmed pilot to a feature film that flopped way harder than any Star Trek film has ever flopped, because it might as well have been AI generated for how much it wasted Michelle Yeoh's character, talent, and star power. And just like that, Star Trek went from a resurrected Titan back to a fading ember. It all happened so fast with so much content being produced in the meantime that it was just incredibly disorienting. That brings us to last year, 2024, when National Amusements decided they just wouldn't be able to keep the ship afloat. So they put the entire corporate umbrella up for sale. Almost immediately, they got a bite from Skydance Media. Do you want to know how much the entire National Amusements portfolio ended up getting sold for? Like all of this at once. You know how much this is worth? $8 billion. That's it. And Skydance originally offered $2 billion for the whole shebang. Astonishing. Now, Skydance has already collaborated with Paramount on multiple projects over the last 20 years, including the Star Trek reboot film, so they aren't new to this conversation by any means. And if we're just talking numbers and industrial logistics, this deal actually makes all the sense in the world, especially for Paramount. The issue is that if this deal goes through, Skydance could wield so much influence over the Hollywood industry that it just might violate federal antitrust laws. As of recording this video, the deal is currently under review by the United States federal government. But considering that Skydance is owned by the Ellison family, very close friends of the current administration, I think it's probably going to go through. If the deal doesn't go through, then National Amusements will probably consider selling specific divisions a la carte. How that would play out is anyone's guess at this point. But if it does go through, Star Trek will very likely stay in production in some form. Or it could go dormant for 1 or 2 years while Skydance ducks down to reload. But either way, the list of corporate controllers would be Skydance Media, National Amusements, Viacom CBS, Paramount Pictures, Paramount Television, Paramount Plus, and Secret Hideout. So there's the too many cooks problem. And now we're finally ready to talk about the other 2 problems, which I promise will take a fraction of the time that we've already spent. So just stay with me. Problem number 2, writing for the cultural landscape. Now, there are 2 sides to this particular problem. The first is that industry norms have changed considerably after transitioning to the streaming model. For decades, the US has been accustomed to 1-hour dramas consisting of at least 20 episodes per season. For Star Trek, TNG, DS9, and Voyager all got 7 seasons, averaging at around 26 episodes each, for a rough total of 182 episodes per show. In the Latinum Age, the norm has been a fraction of that output, just 10 episodes per season. Discovery and Lower Decks both got 5 seasons for a total of 50 episodes each. Picard was a limited 3-season run by design, so that was 30 episodes. Prodigy, being a Nickelodeon show, actually got 20 episodes per season, but only 2 seasons, so 40 episodes. And just 2 days before filming this very video, it was announced that Strange New Worlds will end after an abbreviated 5th season, which will see it finish with a total number of 46 episodes. To put this into context, the Latinum Age has produced a grand total of 216 episodes of Star Trek, 5 shows across 8 years. By contrast, TNG alone produced 176 episodes, 1 show over 7 years. At that rate, had it survived for 2 more seasons, we would have more episodes of TNG than all of the episodes of the entire Latinum Age combined. Now, the benefits of this much leaner approach are that the shows can have seasonal story arcs with pretty much 0 filler and a lightning fast pace, which makes them extremely bingeable. But it also allows for significantly more time and money to be spent on things like the acting, the filming, and the special effects. So while the volume of Star Trek content per capita, if you will, has fallen by something like 60%, which to be clear is kind of shocking, the overall production quality of that content has also increased by orders of magnitude. But there are disadvantages to this approach too, mainly that the pace of storytelling is so relentlessly hyper and so packed with plot events that there's basically no time for meaningful character development. The other side of this is the state of real-life culture. Part of the reason Star Trek's Golden Age was so resonant was because our culture as a whole was more receptive and optimistic toward Star Trek's vision back then. That, plus the higher number of episodes, allowed the writing to be more subtle, cunning, seductive, even while it was presenting some truly challenging thematic concepts. But today, our culture is so fractured and siloed that public discourse has devolved into a never-ending culture war built on social identity politics, and the attention economy that now powers the internet has yielded greater rewards for strategies like blunt force and a temperament skewed toward outrage. So the creative approach that tends to find more traction now is less seductive and more forceful. Look, Star Trek has always been preachy about its wokeness, but the Latinum Age has seen it get downright militant about it, which to a lot of legacy fans, including the ones that see themselves as socially progressive, still feels like kind of a step backwards. Besides, this sledgehammer-like approach is not likely to do it any favors with the Ellison family, who are about to become its new owners. So there's problem number 2. Now let's go to the final problem. Problem number 3. Logistics. I said in a previous video that the biggest reason TNG and DS9 were as good as they were was because they aired in first-run syndication. And the reason syndication worked so well for Star Trek was because it was isolated from a very specific dilemma. See, major broadcast networks rely on a business model called FAST, free ad-supported television, which depends entirely on advertising revenue. So they have to get really picky about which shows occupy which time slots in the broadcast, because each slot and show appeals to a certain target demographic, and those demographics in turn represent different numbers of dollars. So the shows that have the most appeal for the most profitable demographic tend to get the most favorable placements in the schedule, something we used to call prime time. And of course, prime time slots are always reserved for the shows that the network has an exclusive license to air, because you can't watch those shows anywhere else. The appeal is concentrated. But that comes with a downside too, because it means that the show has to turn out incredible numbers consistently and reliably for a long period of time. It's high risk, high reward, so either your show kills the game or the game kills your show. Syndication took some of that pressure off, which benefited Star Trek immensely, but because the license wasn't exclusive, the big players were never going to place it in prime time. Yes, TNG and DS9 were literally everywhere, practically inescapable, but they also aired at kind of ridiculous times of the day, like 3 in the afternoon or 10 at night, because without an exclusive license, no network had any incentive to prioritize them. So the fact that both shows still managed to perform as well as they did is still kind of extraordinary. Now, today, the market situation is unrecognizably different from all of that. With almost all streaming now taking place in an on-demand context, the very concept of a broadcast schedule is closer to irrelevant now than it's ever been. So how do content producers evaluate how well their shows are performing now? Analytics. This is true even for the providers that do still maintain a linear broadcast schedule. So whether you're watching a 24/7 stream that follows a schedule, kind of emulating the old school broadcast experience, or binging shows on demand instead, either way, your engagement with the content is now measured in units of data, and any ads you see are targeted to you specifically based on what that data says about you. It's completely divorced from how the business used to work, which means that the whole syndication idea is kind of irrelevant now, right? There's no way for Star Trek to achieve in the streaming era anything close to the amount of reach and influence that it enjoyed during the Golden Age, right? I am so glad you asked, because it's finally time for me to propose some solutions. Solution number 1, make Star Trek available everywhere again. I've worked in the fast streaming industry for a couple of years now, and I've noticed 2 distinct patterns in opposite corners of this space. The biggest, most ubiquitous brands in this space seem stuck in this never-ending struggle to achieve and maintain profitability, balancing subscription proceeds against ad revenue, all to support overproduced, low-volume content on exclusive, paywalled platforms. They think it's high-risk, high-reward, but it's really more like high-risk, mid-reward. And it's so chaotic and cutthroat that everyone's either buying or selling or hiring or firing somebody. It's just an endless perfect storm that is frankly lethal to the creative spirit of human beings. But the little guys, the ones you've never heard of, they are quietly building some highly dedicated viewing audiences by licensing their content to as many platforms as possible, particularly platforms using the FAST model as opposed to the subscription model. These are platforms like Roku, Samsung TV Plus, Freecast. And I'm seeing this strategy work for a diverse array of clients that I support in my day job, whether they're news outlets or niche genre programmers or even social media content creators just trying to branch out. This is the streaming equivalent of broadcast syndication. Now, most of you are probably not engaging with most of the content that's available in this space right now, because like I said, the people who are doing well in this space right now are the little guys. But I'm pretty sure that all that this corner of industry needs to blow up is for a large enough IP with the right kind of pull to just move in. I remind you, TNG and DS9 were the only Star Trek shows to have run entirely in syndication, and they are also almost unanimously considered to be the two best shows in the entire Star Trek franchise when it comes to meaning and overall quality. That is not a coincidence, but it is a wake-up call. Voyager did some pretty great things for UPN. UPN did not do very many great things for Voyager. Still a great show and my personal favorite, but it had a fraction of the cultural impact that TNG and DS9 did because it was chained to a network. And critically, UPN started dying after Voyager ended, and Enterprise could not save it. Paramount Plus is today's equivalent of UPN. So there is a lesson to be learned here for those who have eyes to see it. And that lesson is platform exclusivity is bad for Star Trek. And even when Star Trek is very good, it's never going to save a struggling broadcast network or streaming service. So to the powers that be, read my lips. If you really love Star Trek, then break its chains. It has worked wonders before, and I believe in my bones that it can happen again. But if it's ever going to have a shot, you have got to set it free. So stop demanding that the audience flock to your paywall in exchange for access to this uniquely powerful franchise. Stop insisting that Star Trek earn its place in your library by carrying a fledgling or bloated or dying distribution pipeline on its back. Put it back into syndication where it belongs. Make it available everywhere again. I am begging you. And here is my final plea. Solution number 2, write to lead, not to follow. Gene Roddenberry created Star Trek to pull humanity forward toward a very particular vision of the future. It's always had a particular social agenda that is uniquely its own and is at the very heart of its enduring appeal. It is the message that defines the soul of Star Trek, but how that message is presented matters. In fact, it just might be everything. Roddenberry was not a perfect man, and maybe not even a good one, but he understood one very important thing about human beings. A lure is more effective than a shove. And a good story told well is the vehicle that a bold message needs in order to be truly compelling to as many people as possible. In my opinion, the greatest failure of the Latinum Age is the decision to wrap the message up in star power, stratospheric production values, and a storytelling approach that is so sharp and acute that a misaligned viewer ends up feeling either admonished or condescended to, instead of invited, challenged to be better. It's the same value system that Star Trek has always had, but the blunt force delivery style makes it feel like an acquiescence to the brutish culture that we're all drowning in, instead of rising above it and daring us to follow. I really believe that Roddenberry meant for Star Trek to lead us by a portrayed example, to plant its feet firmly in a quasi-utopian future and beckon us toward it. But it hasn't been doing that very consistently for kind of a long time now. and has thus failed to wield the full extent of its power. So we need writers who remember how to emphasize a compelling story in which the message can be nestled for an effective delivery. If that comes at the cost of razzle-dazzle special effects and a cast of actors who get mentioned at awards ceremonies, so be it. I really don't think Star Trek needs those things anyway, all things considered. And on that note, the short, bingeable seasonal story arcs are just, they're getting tiresome, honestly. I think we're all kind of sick of it. And I get that doing 26 episodes every 12 months is crazy. That is unsustainable. But just 10 episodes every 18 to 24 months? That's not better. So this is me pleading with you to split the difference. Give us like 16 to 18 episodes every 12 months, with at least a couple of them dedicated to one-offs focused on character development or something. Ease off the special effects and household names if you have to, because, at least as far as I'm concerned, that exchange is 100% worth it. So there's my pitch. Hopefully it resonates with someone who has actual influence at Paramount or any of its parent companies. I hope that everything I've covered here demonstrates the extent to which I've been paying attention to the patterns and have earnestly tried to qualify my perspective. I have no intention of trying to claim any authority that does not belong to me. I just care deeply about this franchise, and I believe wholeheartedly in its unique potential to help shape our future in ways that benefit all of us. So thank you for watching and for your attention. Live long and prosper.